Wyoming Territory, July 1872. The sun had nearly dropped beneath the jagged teeth of the Wind River Range when she stumbled, barefoot and shaking, into the orange glow of a lone campfire. Mabel Dearing's dress was torn at the hem, her lips cracked dry. Dust clung to her like grief, and her arms trembled as she stepped forward, blinking against the smoke curling from the fire. She looked like a ghost come out of the sagebrush until the cowboy looked up, and that changed everything. "Ma'am," he said, rising slowly from where he had knelt beside a coffee pot. His voice was low, careful. "You hurt." Mabel opened her mouth to speak, but only a rasp came out. She pressed her fingers to her throat, then shook her head. Her knees buckled. The man moved fast, boots crunching dead pine needles as he caught her before she hit the ground. He was warm, solid. He smelled like leather and ash and horses. She gripped his shirt with what little strength she had left, her eyes fluttering closed when she woke. The stars were out. She was wrapped in a blanket, lying beside the fire. A tin cup of water rested near her hand. Her boots, gone for 2 days, were replaced by thick wool socks. She sat up too quickly and the world tilted. "You should drink a little slower," came that voice again. She turned her head. He was seated across from her, elbows on his knees, his face lit soft by firelight. He was young, maybe 25, with dark brown hair curling beneath his hat and a short beard that looked like it had grown out of long days alone. His eyes held a kind of quiet steadiness that made her throat ache. "I need to get back," Mabel said hoarsely. "My boy, my daughter, they're still with the wagon." The cowboy's brows pulled together. "You got left behind," she nodded, tears rising sharp. "I stepped away to look for firewood. They must have thought I was in the last wagon. When I came back, they were gone, 2 days ago." "Damn," he said under his breath. Then more gently, "You walked 2 days alone." "I could not leave them. William is 8. Maggie just turned 5. Her hands gripped the blanket. "They need me." He stood, dusted off his trousers, and crossed to his saddlebags. "Name's Abram Oakes," he said without turning. "I was heading south, but that can wait. We ride at first light. We will find your children." Mabel stared at him. "You do not even know me." Abram shrugged. "You walked across the wilds for your children. That is enough." They rode out just before dawn. Mabel's body ached from dehydration and exhaustion, but Abram had packed jerky and hard biscuits, and his chestnut mare was calm under her. He rode beside her on a dappled gray, his rifle strapped to the saddle and his eyes always scanning the horizon. They followed wagon tracks through the dry grass, half erased by wind and time. Mabel's hands clenched the reins. She kept seeing William's wide brown eyes, the way he always tried to act older than he was. Maggie's curls, bouncing as she ran beside the wagon. She could not lose them. Around midday, they crested a ridge, and Abram pulled his horse to a halt, pointing. "Smoke." Mabel followed his gaze. In the distance, thin gray wisps curled above a stand of cottonwoods. "That could be them," she whispered, "or someone else," Abram said. "Stay behind me." They rode in silence, hearts pounding. As they neared the grove, they heard voices faint but familiar. Mabel's heart leapt. Then she saw them. William sat on a log, holding Maggie close. A woman from the wagon train stood nearby, her face pale with worry. Mabel kicked her mare forward and slid off before the horse stopped. "Mama," William cried. Maggie burst into tears and threw herself into Mabel's arms. Mabel dropped to her knees, sobbing as she held them both. "I thought I lost you," she whispered into their hair. "I tried, I ran. We waited," William said, voice cracking. "I told them you would come." The wagon train had realized their mistake too late. They had circled back and waited in the grove overnight, praying she would find them. The woman, Mrs. Keating, clasped Mabel's hands and apologized through tears. When the children were safely tucked into blankets, Mabel sat beside Abram by the fire. The others had offered him food, but he had declined. His eyes stayed on the flames. "You should stay with them," he said finally. "They need you." She looked at him. The firelight turned his face gold. "I am not leaving them, but I am not letting you ride off alone either." His brow lifted. "You just got your children back. And I would not have if not for you." He shook his head. "You would have found them. I only kept the fire lit." Mabel smiled, tired but certain. "That fire saved my life." He looked at her, then really looked. You are something, Mabel Dearing. She reached out and touched his hand. I think you are too. He did not pull away. By morning, the wagon train was ready to move. Abram helped load their things, lifting Maggie up onto the wagon seat with gentle care. William watched him with wide eyes. You are a cowboy, he said. Do you shoot bad men? Only if I have to, Abram said with a wink. Are you going to ride with us? Maggie asked. He looked at Mabel. That your call, she smiled, heart full. We could use a good firekeeper. He mounted his horse and rode beside their wagon as they moved out. Mabel sat with her children, the sun warm on her face, Abram's shadow falling beside theirs. She had been left behind and nearly broken. But somehow, through dust and firelight and a stranger's quiet strength, she had found something steadier than fear. She had found the start of something real. Dust rose behind the wagon wheels, trailing them eastward beneath a blistering sky. By the second day, Mabel had learned the sound of Abram's horses, gait steady, unhurried, always just behind or alongside the wagon, never crowding. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but when he did, it was with the same quiet certainty that had steadied her when she'd collapsed into his firelight. They stopped near a creek that evening, the water low but clear. While the other families set to boiling beans and patching canvas, Mabel knelt at the bank, scrubbing her daughter's petticoat against a stone. Maggie waited nearby, her hem tied up with twine, pointing at dragonflies. William wandered off with a stick, chasing after trail beetles. Abram's shadow stretched across the water before he spoke. Mind if I water the horses here? She looked up, brushing a strand of damp hair from her brow. Plenty of room. He led his gray to the bend, unfastened the bridle, and let the animal drink. I never asked, she said, rinsing the cloth. Where were you headed before we met? He crouched, one hand on his knee, watching the water move. Was riding for the Sweetwater River. Fella there owes me a debt in cattle, figured I'd collect. Will you still go? Eventually, not in a rush, she wrung out the petticoat, her knuckles white. You changed direction for me, didn't feel like a detour. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask again. That night, after the children had curled into their bedrolls atop the wagon boards, Mabel stepped away from the firelight. She found Abram sitting on an overturned crate near the picket line, oiling his saddle. The scent of pine tar and worn leather drifted between them. You don't talk much, she said. I say what needs saying. She folded her arms. What do you see when you look at me? He didn't look up. Someone who's got more grit than most men I've met. That's not an answer. He set the oiling cloth aside. I see a woman who don't scare easy. Who didn't wait to be saved, her voice tightened. I was terrified, still moved forward. They were quiet a long time. Crickets rasped in the grass. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called. I was married once, she said finally. He died of fever crossing the Kansas line. We buried him near a cottonwood with no name. Abram's jaw worked. How long ago? 4 months, he nodded once. That's fresh. She turned her face toward the dark horizon. I keep thinking I'm supposed to be strong because the children need me to be. But some nights it's like there's a weight I can't set down. His voice was low. You don't need to carry it alone. She didn't reply, but she stayed, leaning against the wagon's rear gate as the stars wheeled above them. By the next afternoon, the wagon train met a fork in the trail. One path led toward Cheyenne, where the soldiers patrolled and the rail touched civilization. The other bent north, toward smaller towns and scattered ranches. The families argued around the fire, voices hushed but firm. Mabel listened, arms around her little ones, gaze flicking to Abram, whose face gave nothing away when the decision was made to split the train, half heading south, half pushing north in hopes of better grazing. Mabel stood a long time beside the wagon tongue, staring at the dust-streaked canvas. You got a plan? Abram asked behind her. She turned, holding his gaze. I think I need to stop running, he nodded. There's a ranch near Muddy Creek. Fences need mending. They keep a school ledger. Might be a place for you and the children. Her mouth lifted, but it wasn't quite a smile. You've been there, passed by once, never stayed. She studied him, the worn lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his hands always seemed to be fixing or building something. Would you consider staying this time? He didn't answer right away. Then softly, if you're there, I might. Mabel reached out, fingers brushing his. Then let's go north. The trail north bent through low hills and into a valley where cottonwoods lined a creek that ran shallow but steady. Mabel guided the wagon behind Abram's mare, the children dozing against one another on a folded quilt. The new ox team loaned by a family bound for Cheyenne moved slower but steady. Each mile west of the split left the noise of the wagon train behind, and with it, the weight of other people's eyes. By the fourth day, the dust had settled on her shoulders like belonging. She no longer glanced behind her. She watched Abram. He rode ahead most mornings, his rifle slung across his back, disappearing into the brush when the trail narrowed. When he returned, he offered nothing but a quiet nod, sometimes holding out a handful of berries or a fresh rabbit slung from his saddle. That evening, he laid the meat across a pan, his sleeves rolled past the elbow, and glanced at her only once as the fat began to hiss in the fire. "You ever work stock?" he asked. She stretched her legs out toward the flames. "My husband once bartered fence labor for seed. I helped him mend wire across a half-acre patch outside Independence." Abram turned the meat. "You're not afraid of hard work. If I were, I'd have never left Missouri." He nodded, then folded the rabbit onto a tin plate and passed it to her. She took it without hesitation, the firelight painting the shadows of his hands dark across the rim. Later, after the children had curled into sleep, she found him kneeling in the grass by the horses, checking each hoof with methodical care. She crouched beside him, picking burrs from the mare's mane. "You always this careful?" she asked. "No point rushing a creature that never asked to carry you." She brushed the hair back from the animal's eyes. "You always take care of things that don't ask." He paused, then met her gaze, the lantern light catching in the flecks of his eyes. "When I can." She didn't look away. "Do you ever wonder what you're meant for?" He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Most times I figure it's just to keep going till something makes sense." Mabel reached for the lantern, her fingers brushing his across the handle. "And if it already makes sense and you're just too stubborn to see it," he didn't pull away. "Then I'd hope someone be patient enough to say so plain." She lifted the lantern, the light trembling in her grip. "I'm saying it now." The silence held between them, full and still. Then his hand closed gently over hers, grounding the lantern's sway. The next morning, she woke to find a split-rail fence rising in the distance. A low barn sat tucked near a bend in the creek, its roof weathered silver. The ranch house stood behind it, simple but sound, with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Two men were working near the corral, their sleeves rolled up, talking low over a stack of rough-cut boards. Abram dismounted and approached. Words passed between them. One man, a rangy fellow with thinning hair and a sunburned neck, nodded, then pointed toward the house. By the time Mabel climbed down from the wagon, Abram had returned. "They need help," he said. "Hired hands cleared out last week. Rancher's name is Callan. He's willing to trade room and board for labor." She looked toward the porch, where a young woman stood with a child on her hip and a baby tied in a sling across her chest. The woman raised a hand in greeting. "Maggie could run with that girl," Mabel said. "And William?" Abram asked. She smiled. "He's old enough to learn fence work." Abram's eyes softened. "You'd stay?" Mabel glanced back at her children, then at the house, its door open to the morning light. "We'd build something here. Together." She stepped closer, her voice low. "If you'll stay with us." He looked at her a long moment, then nodded once. "I reckon I will." And just like that, the road behind them closed. The dust settled. The trail ended not in goodbye, but in the shape of something solid, something stitched from quiet trust in kind hands. That evening, she stood beside him on the porch as the sun bled out across the hills. His shoulder brushed hers, and her hand found his without reaching. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The first snow came early that year, soft and soundless, layering the fence posts and barn roof in a thin crust. Mabel stood at the open barn door, Maggie's small hand in hers, watching Abram toss down hay from the loft. His coat was patched at the elbow, the leather stiff from use, but he moved with a kind of practiced ease, the pitchfork sliding through straw like it knew his rhythm. Maggie tugged her sleeve. "Can we help?" She looked down at her daughter's eager face, then back at Abram, who paused, one boot braced against the ladder rung. "You mind a pair of extra hands?" Mabel asked. He set the pitchfork aside and climbed down. "Not if they're careful near the mule." Mabel walked Maggie over to the feed sacks, showing her how to scoop without spilling. Abram watched for a beat, then turned to check the stall latches. He didn't say anything, but his mouth twitched in that way it sometimes did when something pleased him but he didn't want to show it. Later, as the wind picked up and the sky took on that flat white look that promised more snow, Abram carried a pail of water to the porch. William was sitting cross-legged beside the door, carving a stick with a dull-bladed knife Abram had given him the week before. The boy looked up as he approached. "Did you ever have a brother?" William asked. Abram set the pail down and wiped his hands on his trousers. "I had two." "Both older?" "Where are they?" Abram lowered himself to the step, the boards creaking under his weight. "One died in the war, the other drifted off to California after. Haven't heard from him since." William sat quiet a moment, then nodded. "I think if I had brothers, I'd want them close." Abram glanced toward the barn. "Some folks don't know what to do with closeness once they've seen what distance can protect." William frowned, not quite understanding, but nodded again as if he did. Inside, Mabel was folding the mended shirts she'd taken in from the line before the flurries started. The ranch house was warmer than she'd expected it to be when they arrived. Callan's wife had insisted on a second stove, and the kitchen walls held in the heat well. Maggie sat by the hearth, humming as she pushed buttons into a scrap of cloth, pretending it was a doll. Mabel glanced out the window and saw Abram still on the porch, talking to William. Neither of them moved much, but something about the way their shoulders angled toward each other made her chest tighten. Not in fear, in something slower, something earned. That night after supper, Callan offered Abram a permanent hands pay. The ranch was expanding, more stock, more fencing, more mouths to feed. They needed someone steady. Abram didn't answer right away. He looked across the table at Mabel before he spoke. "I'll stay if there's room for more than just my boots under that roof." Callan raised a brow. Meaning I don't plan to keep sleeping in the bunkhouse come spring." Mabel didn't look away. Her voice was quiet but sure. "There's more than room." The next morning, she woke to him already splitting kindling outside. The children were still asleep, the house hushed in that pale hour before dawn. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. "You didn't need to start without breakfast," she said. He paused, setting the axe aside. "Didn't want you doing it with cold hands." She lifted the hem of her shawl to her face, the wind sharp against her cheeks. "You planning to keep doing that?" He tilted his head. "Doing what?" "Making space for me without asking." He looked at her, snowflakes catching in his beard. "That's not space, that's a place." She reached out, touching his wrist. "And you're sure it's with me?" "For the first time in years," he said. "I know where I'm meant to be." She didn't answer. She just stepped closer, their breath mingling in the cold, her fingers finding his as easily as if they'd held hands every winter before. And though the wind picked up and the snow came heavier, neither of them moved. They had found something stronger than weather, steadier than fear. Something that would hold. The spring thaw came gradual and slow, turning packed snow into mud along the eastern fence line. Abram worked the posts with William at his side, the boy taller now by half a hand, his shoulders starting to square out like a man's. Mabel watched from the porch, a basket of mended linens balanced on her hip, and felt something ease inside her that she hadn't known was still tight. Inside, Maggie sat at the table with Callan's youngest, stringing cornflower petals together on a length of twine. The two girls had grown close in the quiet way children do without ceremony, just side by side through the days. Mabel set the basket down and knelt beside them. "Mind if I borrow you both to gather eggs?" she asked. Maggie grinned and dashed for her shawl. The other girl followed without a word, and together they trotted out toward the henhouse, boots squelching in the soft earth. By evening, the wind had settled. Abram came in with dirt on his palms and a fresh line of sun across his brow. He washed up at the pump while Mabel stirred beans over the stove, the scent of sage and salt pork rising with the steam. She didn't speak until he stepped behind her and reached for the tin plates. "I heard from Callan," she said, keeping her eyes on the pot. "He says the north pasture's yours to run if you want it." Abram set the plates down carefully. "You think we'd make good neighbors? I think we've moved past that." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You see yourself raising goats now. If they stay out of my herb beds, I'll consider it." He grinned, slow and warm. "You sure about this?" "I am," she said, turning to face him. "But not because it's easy. Because I've watched you build things that last." He reached for her then, not rushed, just sure. His hand rested at her waist, thumb brushing the edge of her apron. She leaned into him, cheek against his chest, the sound of his breathing steadier than any clock. They married in midsummer, beneath the tallest cottonwood near the creek bend. Callan's wife stitched the dress from spare muslin and blue ribbon, and the children gathered wildflowers for the table. William stood beside Abram, his chin held high, while Maggie held tight to Mabel's hand, her curls pinned back with little sprigs of mint. Afterward, they shared bread and cider in the barn, the air full of fiddle music and laughter. Abram's hand never left hers, not even while he danced with Maggie or lifted Callan's boy onto his shoulders to see the lanterns strung overhead. That night, with the house quiet and the windows open to the warm breeze, Mabel stood at the doorway to the room they'd built together. The pine walls still smelled fresh, the quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Abram stepped behind her, arms circling her waist. "You ever think," he said softly, "how strange it is that loss brought us here?" She turned in his arms. "No. I think it's what we did with the pieces that mattered." He nodded against her hair. "You know I'd do it all again, every mile. I'd walk it twice," she said, barefoot. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Years passed. The children grew. William took over calving in the cold months, his hands steady and strong. Maggie learned the names of every plant that grew near the creek and could spot feverweed from 20 paces. The ranch grew, but not too big, just enough. In the evenings, Mabel and Abram sat on the porch swing he built with his own hands, her knitting in her lap, his fingers wrapped around hers. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. The road that had once left her behind had brought her to something steadier, not perfect, not easy. Just honest and full and hers. And when the sun sank low behind the hills, casting long shadows over the grass, she leaned into him and knew without any doubt that she had finally come home.